The wind howled through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, carrying with it a biting chill that seemed to gnaw at the very bones of anyone foolish enough to be out on such a night. It was late November, the kind of evening where the sky turns a bruised purple and the streetlights reflect off the slick, wet pavement like spilled oil. Amidst the rush of luxury sedans and pedestrians huddled in expensive wool coats, a solitary figure trudged slowly down Michigan Avenue. His name was Matthew Gonzalez, a 34-year-old man whose face was smeared with soot and grime, masking the strong jawline and weary eyes beneath. He wore a canvas jacket that had seen better decades, ripped at the elbow and stained with dark grease, and his boots dragged heavy and wet against the sidewalk. To the casual observer, Matthew was just another statistic, a piece of urban debris to be stepped around and ignored. But beneath the layers of filth and the trembling posture, Matthew was hiding a truth that would soon shatter the composure of one of the city's most exclusive establishments. He was not homeless, nor was he destitute. He was a lieutenant with the Chicago Fire Department, a man who had pulled children from burning buildings and cut families out of mangled cars. Tonight, however, he was on a different kind of mission, one born from a painful conversation with his late mentor, a retired captain who had died alone and unrecognized after falling on hard times. Matthew had made a vow to see if empathy still existed in the city he served, or if the uniform was the only thing that commanded respect. Matthew stopped in front of the Gilded Lily, a French bistro that was the current darling of the city's elite. The windows glowed with a warm golden light, revealing a scene of opulence inside. Crystal chandeliers dripping light onto white linen tablecloths, men in tailored suits laughing over, glasses of Pinot Noir and women in silk dresses picking at a skirt. The contrast between the warmth inside and the freezing misery of the street was stark. Matthew took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of roasted garlic and brown butter that wafted from the vents. Fighting the urge to straighten his back and walk with his usual confident stride, he slumped his shoulders, rubbed more dirt into his hairline, and pushed open the heavy oak door. The bell above the entrance chimed, a cheerful sound that seemed to die instantly as the heavy silence of the room descended upon him. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Conversations halted mid. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. A collective gasp of indignation rippled through the dining room as the patrons took in the sight of the intruder. Matthew stood in the entryway, water dripping from his frayed trousers onto the pristine marble floor, creating a small, muddy puddle. He looked around with wide, nervous eyes, playing the part of a man who was lost and desperate. He didn't ask for money. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, shivering, clutching his stomach as if in pain. From the back of the room, a man approached with the speed and aggression of a guard dog spotting a fence jumper. This was Gregory Roberts, the 55-year-old general manager of the Gilded Lily. Gregory was a man who prided himself on the exclusivity of his establishment. He wore a three-piece suit that cost more than most people's cars, and his face was perpetually set in a sneer of superiority. To Gregory, poverty was not a tragedy. It was an aesthetic offense, a stain to be scrubbed away before it could ruin the appetite of his high-paying clientele. Gregory barked, his voice slicing through the tense silence like a whip. He stopped 3 feet from Matthew, refusing to come closer, as if the grime on Matthew's jacket might jump across the gap and infect him. You are in the wrong place. The soup kitchen is 6 blocks east. Turn around and leave. Matthew looked at him, letting a tremor run through his hands. I have money, Matthew stammered, his voice raspy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled handful of small bills, ones, fives, and a frightening amount of quarters. It was about $28. Plenty for a simple meal at a diner, but laughable in a place where an appetizer started at $40. I just want something warm. Please. Gregory laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Money? Money, Gregory scoffed, stepping forward to block Matthew's path further. Look at you. You are dripping filth on my floor. You smell like a chimney and a wet dog. We have a dress code here, and quite frankly, we have a hygiene code. You are disturbing my guests. The humiliation in the room was thick enough to choke on. A couple at a nearby table giggled, the woman whispering something behind her hand while pointing at Matthew's boots. Matthew felt the heat rise in his chest. The firefighter in him wanted to square up, to tell this man that he made more of a difference in one shift than Gregory did in a lifetime, but he held his ground, staying in character. I can pay, Matthew insisted quietly. I'll sit in the back, Gregory shouted, reaching out to grab Matthew's arm to physically shove him. But before his manicured hand could make contact with the dirty canvas jacket, a soft but firm voice interrupted. Mr. the manager froze and spun around. Standing there, holding a tray of empty wine glasses, was Michelle Lee. She was 24 years old, a waitress who had been working double shifts at the Gilded Lily for 6 months. Michelle looked exhausted. Dark circles were faintly visible under her concealer, and her uniform, though clean, was slightly too large, hinting at recent weight loss. She was a nursing student putting herself through school, balancing clinical rotations with late nights serving ungrateful patrons. She knew what it was like to count quarters. She knew what it was like to be hungry so you could afford heat. Gregory's face turned a shade of crimson. Michelle, get back to table 4. Michelle set the tray down on a service station with a clatter that made Gregory flinch. She walked over to Matthew, ignoring the manager's glare and the whispers of the customers. She looked Matthew in the eye, not at his dirt, not at his clothes, but at his eyes. She saw the fatigue there, the human need. He's a paying customer, Gregory, she said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. There's an empty two-top near the kitchen swinging door. It's out of sight. She turned to Matthew and offered a small, tentative smile. Sir, if you have money to pay, we can serve you. Gregory was He stepped between Michelle and Matthew, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. If you seat him, he whispered, spitting the words at her, you are cleaning that chair with a toothbrush. And if he cannot pay the full bill, including the service charge, it comes out of your tips. Every cent. Do you understand me? It was a cruel ultimatum. Gregory knew Michelle was struggling. He knew she picked up every extra shift available. He was banking on her fear of financial loss to override her compassion. Michelle paused. She looked at Matthew, who was watching her with an intensity that felt heavy. She looked at the crumpled bills in his hand. She knew the menu prices. She knew $28 wouldn't cover a steak. It might barely cover a soup and a water. If he ordered more, she would be paying for it. She would lose the money she needed for her textbooks. For a long, agonizing second, the restaurant held its breath. Matthew watched her, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was the test. This was the moment his mentor had talked about, the moment where humanity is weighed against convenience. Michelle took a deep breath, squared her narrow shoulders, and nodded. I understand, Mr. Roberts, she said quietly. She turned her back on her boss and gestured for Matthew to follow. As Matthew followed her through the maze of tables, he felt the burning stares of the wealthy patrons. He heard the muttering, but he also saw the straight line of Michelle's back as she led him to a small table near the kitchen doors. It was a drafty spot, noisy from the clatter of pots and pans, but to Matthew, it felt like the most VIP seat in the house. She pulled out the chair for a Hema gesture of respect usually reserved for her rollers and waited for him to sit. I'm Michelle, she said, placing a menu in front of him. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some water? Matthew looked up at her, catching the worry she was trying to hide behind her professional smile. He saw her glancing nervously toward the front of the house where Gregory was aggressively talking on the phone, likely complaining to the owner or the police. Matthew unfolded his dirty napkin and placed it on his lap with a deliberation that seemed out of place for a homeless man. Thank you, Michelle, he said, allowing a bit of his natural, authoritative voice to slip through the rasp. Water would be great, Michelle nodded, her eyes lingering on his hands for a moment, hands that were dirty, yes, but calloused and strong, not the hands of a man who had given up, but the hands of a man who worked. She sensed something was different, but she couldn't place it. I'll bring the bread right away, she promised, and hurried off toward the kitchen. Left alone for a moment, Matthew observed the room. He saw Gregory watching him from the bar, eyes narrowed, tapping a heavy gold watch. The manager was waiting for a slip-up. He was waiting for Matthew to be loud, or rude, or to try and steal silverware. Matthew knew that the conflict was far from over. In fact, he realized as he watched Gregory whisper to a busboy while pointing at Matthew's table, the real test was just beginning. Gregory wasn't going to let him eat in peace. He was going to try to break him. Matthew tightened his grip on the menu, his knuckles white beneath the soot. All right, Gregory, he thought. Let's see how far you'll go. Michelle returned to the table with a tray that seemed heavy with more than just porcelain. She placed a steaming bowl of French onion soup in front of Matthew, the rich aroma of beef broth, caramelized onions, and melted Gruyere cheese instantly enveloping the small, drafty corner near the kitchen. Beside it, she set a basket of warm, crusty baguette slices and a tall glass of ice water. Matthew looked at the food, and for a moment, the act wasn't an act anymore. He had been walking the streets for 6 hours in the freezing wind to get into character, and his body was genuinely crying out for warmth. He picked up the spoon, his hand trembling slightly, partly from the cold, partly from the adrenaline of the situation, and took a sip. The heat spread through his chest, a stark contrast to the icy reception he had received from the rest of the room. He looked up at Michelle, who was hovering nearby, pretending to organize silverware at a service station so she could keep an eye on him. Her anxiety was palpable. Every time the kitchen door swung open or Gregory Roberts walked by the bar, she flinched, her eyes darting to Matthew's table to ensure he wasn't causing a scene. "It's good," Matthew said, his voice rough but sincere. He broke a piece of bread and dipped it into the broth. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this. I saw the way your boss looked at you." Michelle moved a step closer, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry over the din of the dining room. "Mr. Roberts is particular," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But he's not the law. You're hungry and you have money. That's how a restaurant works. Just eat slowly, enjoy it." Matthew studied her face. He saw the fatigue etched into the corners of her eyes, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, likely nursing aching soles from a double shift. Matthew asked softly, "You have the hands of someone who fixes things. Efficient." Michelle blinked, surprised by the observation. A small, genuine smile broke through her mask of stress. "Nursing school," she admitted, glancing down at her hands. "Final year. I work here to pay for tuition and rent. It's a lot, but I want to help people. Real help, you know?" Matthew nodded slowly. "That's a noble path." He paused, deciding to push the conversation deeper to test the limits of her empathy. "My friend, he was like you. Good heart. He fell on hard times, though. Got sick, lost his job. People stopped looking him in the eye. They just saw the dirt, not the man. He died last year." It wasn't a lie. It was the story of his mentor, Captain Miller, stripped of the specific details of his rank, but the pain in Matthew's voice was real. Michelle's expression softened into profound sadness. She looked at Matthew not as a customer, but as a human being carrying a heavy burden. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "My dad, he had a similar story. Worked in a steel mill for 30 years. The mill closed, his pension evaporated, and he just crumbled. It happened so fast. One month we were fine, the next we were selling the furniture. I know how thin the line is between sitting at that table," she gestured to a group of laughing businessmen, "and sitting where you are. Most people think they're immune." This revelation hit Matthew hard. It explained her courage. She wasn't just being nice. She was seeing her father in him. She was fighting a ghost through him. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. Gregory Roberts had returned, and he looked displeased to see Matthew still eating. He checked his watch. "You are taking a very long time with a simple bowl of soup," Gregory sneered, not bothering to lower his voice. "This is a place of business, not a homeless shelter lounge. We have reservations coming in." Matthew looked around. The restaurant was busy, yes, but there were at least 3 other empty two-top tables nearby. This wasn't about capacity. It was about cleansing the aesthetic. "I'm still eating," Matthew said, clutching his spoon. "I paid for, well, I'm going to pay for a meal." "You will finish it now," Gregory snapped. He snapped his fingers at Michelle. "Bring the check immediately." He gestured vaguely at Matthew as if he were a pile of trash. Michelle hesitated, looking from the half-eaten bread to her manager's furious face. "Mr. Roberts, he's not done with the bread," she tried to interject. Gregory's eyes bulged. "No coffee. We are out of coffee for him. Chetna." The threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Michelle went pale. She looked at Matthew with an apologetic plea in her eyes. Matthew nodded slightly, signaling her to do as he said. He didn't want her fired. Not yet. Michelle hurried to the terminal and printed the slip. She walked back slowly, dreading what was coming. She placed the black leather folder on the table. Matthew wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his wad of cash. He counted it out on the table. 5, 10, 11, 12, 20, 25, $28.50. He opened the folder. His heart sank. The bill wasn't for the soup. Gregory had manually adjusted the pricing. Matthew stared at the paper. It was robbery. A bowl of soup was usually $12. The water he had was tap. The bread was complimentary. Gregory had inflated every charge, weaponizing the menu to ensure Matthew couldn't pay. It was a trap designed to justify calling the police. Matthew looked up at Michelle, his eyes wide with feigned panic. This can't be right, he stammered, his hands shaken as he pointed at the total. It's $66 for soup. I have 20. Michelle looked at the bill and gasped. She recognized Gregory's override code at the bottom of the receipt. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. He changed the prices, she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. Before she could say more, Gregory swooped in like a vulture sensing a carcass. He asked smoothly, his voice dripping with false concern that barely masked his triumph. Short on funds? I warned you. You changed the prices, Matthew said, his voice rising slightly, attracting the attention of the nearby tables again. This isn't what the menu says. I have $28. Gregory laughed, a cold, hard sound. Prices are subject to change without notice. It's on the bottom of the menu in fine print. If you can't pay the bill, that is theft of services. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the keypad. I'm calling the police. I've had enough of this charade. You come in here smelling like a sewer, disturb my guests, and now you try to steal food. Matthew sat frozen. This was the moment. The system was rigged against the poor man. Gregory wasn't just kicking him out. He was trying to ruin him, to put him in the system, simply for existing in his space. Matthew watched Michelle. This was the breaking point. She could step away, she could protect her job and let the police handle the homeless man. It was the safe choice. It was the logical choice. The word was quiet, but it stopped Gregory's thumb. Michelle stepped between the manager and the table. Her face was flushed, tears of frustration stinging her eyes, but her chin was high. Gregory looked at her as if she had grown a second head. Excuse me, do you want to lose your job, Michelle? I said no, Michelle repeated, louder this time. The restaurant went silent again. He didn't steal anything. You are cheating him. She reached into her apron pocket, her hand shaking violently. She pulled out her server wallet's a thick black pouch containing all the cash tips she had made that week. It was her rent money. It was her textbook money. She ripped the Velcro open and started pulling out bills. 20s, 10s, 5s. She didn't count them carefully. She just grabbed a handful that she knew was more than $60. She slammed the money onto the table, right on top of the fraudulent bill. There, she said, her voice cracking. There's your money. $66. Plus tip. He paid. She turned to Gregory, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Take it. Put it in the register. Gregory stared at the money, then at Michelle. His face twisted into a mask of pure malice. You stupid girl, he hissed. You think you're a martyr? That was your rent. I heard you crying about it in the break room yesterday. He snatched the money from the table, stuffing it into his pocket. Fine, the bill is paid. But you, he pointed a trembling finger at Michelle. You are done. Pack your things. Get out of my restaurant. Matthew watched in stunned silence. She had actually done it. She had sacrificed her livelihood, her safety net, for a stranger she thought she would never see again. The weight of her action crashed into him. He felt a lump form in his throat that had nothing to do with the act he was playing. This woman, with everything to lose, had stood as a shield for someone she thought had nothing. Gregory turned to Matthew, a smug grin plastered on his face. And you got your free meal? Your guardian angel just got fired for you. I hope it was worth it. Now get out before I call the cops for trespassing. Matthew slowly pushed his chair back. The scrape of the wood against the floor echoed in the silent room. He stood up, but he didn't slouch this time. He didn't tremble. He stood to his full height, 6 feet and 2 inches of solid muscle. The transformation was subtle but terrifying. The weary slump vanished. His eyes, previously cast down in shame, locked on to Gregory's with a piercing intensity that made the manager take an involuntary step back. Matthew reached into his dirty canvas jacket, but he wasn't reaching for more crumpled singles. He was reaching for the badge that was pinned to the inside of his pocket, and the phone that would connect him directly to the city S fire inspector and the local news station. I'm not leaving yet, Gregory, Matthew said, and his voice was completely different, deep, resonant, and commanding. The silence in the Gilded Lily was no longer one of awkward discomfort. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a pendulum swinging back. Matthew Gonzalez stood in the center of the room. His dirty canvas jacket opened to reveal the clean gray t-shirt underneath emblazoned with the emblem of the Chicago Fire Department. He pulled a leather wallet from his inner pocket and flipped it open. The silver badge caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, gleaming with an authority that money couldn't buy. "Lieutenant Matthew Gonzalez, Battalion 4, he stated, his voice projecting to the back of the room without shouting. Gregory snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. He stared at the badge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The arrogance that had armored him just seconds ago began to crack, replaced by a dawning, terrified realization. This wasn't a homeless man. This wasn't someone he could bully into a jail cell. Gregory stammered, his face draining of color. I don't understand. You came in here looking like smelling like... Matthew took a step forward, forcing Gregory to retreat until his back hit the polished mahogany of the host stand. I came in here looking like a human being in need. Matthew corrected him sharply. The smell, that's easy to fake with some grease and charcoal. But the wrought-eye smell in this restaurant, that's how. Matthew turned his gaze to the diners who were now watching with rapt attention, some looking ashamed, others looking thrilled by the turn of events. I serve this city, Matthew addressed the room. My men and I pull people out of burning buildings every week. We don't ask for their bank statements first. We don't check if their clothes are designer. We help them because they are people. He turned back to Michelle, who was standing frozen by the table, her hands still clutching her empty apron. Matthew's expression softened instantly. He walked over to her, ignoring Gregory completely. You, he said gently, you are the only person in this room who passed. You didn't see a bum. You saw a hungry man. Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out the wad of cash Michelle had thrown on the table, the $60-odd of her rent money that Gregory had snatched up. Matthew held out his hand to the manager. Give it back, he commanded. Gregory hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, realizing he had lost control of the narrative. Now, Matthew barked. Gregory fumbled in his pocket and produced the crumpled bills, placing them into Matthew's palm. Matthew smoothed them out and handed them gently back to Michelle. This is yours.